I woke up not knowing my own name. That's how it began. That's the moment everything I thought I knew about existence shattered into fragments I could never piece back together. The darkness of the room pressed against my eyes like velvet curtains, heavy and suffocating. There was no light, save for a strange azure glow that filtered through thick drapes, casting everything in shades of midnight blue and shadow. The air tasted of iron, metallic, sharp. Something warm trickled from the corner of my mouth, and when I touched it, my fingers came away dark and wet. Blood. My blood? Someone else's. I couldn't tell. My mind felt like it was wrapped in cotton, thoughts moving sluggishly through a fog I couldn't penetrate. That's when I saw her. She was sitting in a chair beside what I realized was a bed, my bed, apparently, watching me with eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies within them. Amber eyes. Not brown, not gold, but true amber, like honey held up to firelight. Her skin was impossibly pale, the kind of porcelain white you only see in classical paintings, and her hair fell in dark waves around shoulders draped in burgundy silk. She smiled at me, but it wasn't the kind of smile that brings comfort. It was the smile of someone who knows every secret you've ever kept, every lie you've ever told yourself. It was possession masquerading as affection. Her voice, when she spoke, was like silk dragging across broken glass, beautiful and dangerous all at once. She told me to sleep, that I wasn't ready yet. Ready for what? I wanted to ask, but my tongue felt thick and useless in my mouth. She called me her love, her darling, but the words felt like chains wrapping around my chest. That's when she told me her name, Morgana. She said it like it was a gift, like she was bestowing some great honor upon me. She explained that she had found me dying at the harbor, my body broken among the ruins of old shipping containers and rotting piers. She said I'd been abandoned there, left to die like discarded cargo, and she had saved me. That's the word she used, saved. She'd given me part of her essence, shared her very being with me, pulled me back from the edge of death and into something else entirely. Since that moment, she explained with that same unsettling smile, I no longer felt the sun. The hunger I once knew had transformed into something else, something she controlled with invisible strings I was only beginning to perceive. In the beginning, I believed it was gratitude I felt. How could I not? Morgana cared for me with such meticulous tenderness. She would bring me sustenance, though I learned quickly not to ask what it was or where it came from. She'd hold a crystal goblet to my lips, watching with those amber eyes as I drank, and for a moment, the burning emptiness inside me would subside. She dressed me in clothes of velvet and lace, garments that felt like they belonged in another century. Long gowns in deep jewel tones that rustled when I moved, though I had nowhere to move to. She would sit by the bed, always that same chair, as if she'd claimed it as her throne, and read to me from leather-bound volumes of poetry. Byron, Shelley, Baudelaire. Words about darkness and desire, death and immortality. Her voice would wash over me like a dark lullaby, and sometimes I'd forget where I was. Sometimes I'd almost feel grateful, but it didn't take long for me to notice the details. The windows weren't just covered, they were barred. Elegant wrought iron that might have looked decorative if you didn't study it too closely. But I did. I studied everything because there was nothing else to do. The patterns in the bars were beautiful, yes, but they were designed to keep something in, not to keep something out. The door to my room had a lock, but only on the outside. I discovered this on the third night, or was it the fourth? Time had become strange, flowing like honey, thick and slow. I'd tried the handle while Morgana was away, and my heart had sunk when I realized I couldn't leave even if I wanted to. And the seals, silver seals etched into the doorframe, symbols I didn't recognize but that made my skin crawl when I looked at them too long. They glowed faintly in the darkness, pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost alive. When I finally worked up the courage to ask Morgana why I couldn't leave, she didn't get angry. That might have been easier to understand. Instead, she smiled that smile again and spoke in that honeyed voice that always made everything sound so reasonable, so natural. She told me there were monsters outside, real monsters, not metaphorical ones, creatures that would tear me apart because I was still so young, still so vulnerable in this new form she'd given me. She explained that I hadn't learned to be what I needed to be yet. I hadn't learned to be a monster myself. The way she said it made my blood, if I could even call it that anymore, run cold, because she said it with love, with genuine, terrifying affection. She truly believed she was protecting me, keeping me safe from a world that would destroy this beautiful thing she'd created. Sometimes she called me her progeny, sometimes her beloved. The words would shift depending on her mood, but the meaning behind them never changed. I belonged to her. I was hers in a way that went deeper than ownership, deeper than possession. She had remade me in her image, and in doing so, had claimed every part of me, past, present, and future. As the nights blurred together, was it weeks now? Months? Morgana began what she called my education. She would spend hours teaching me about our kind, about the rules that governed our existence, about the delicate balance between predator and prey that I would need to master. She taught me how to listen to the rhythm of a heartbeat from across a room, how to smell the copper-sweet scent of blood beneath skin, how to identify which humans would be missed and which ones wouldn't. She explained the politics of the vampire world with the casual expertise of someone who'd navigated it for centuries. The territories, the old families, the unspoken hierarchies that could mean the difference between continued existence and swift destruction. But more than teaching me to be a vampire, she was teaching me to be her vampire. Every lesson came wrapped in reminders of how much I owed her, how lost I would be without her guidance, how dangerous the world was for someone as young and inexperienced as I was. She would describe in vivid detail what happened to fledgling vampires who ventured out alone. Stories of young ones torn apart by territorial elders, of vampires driven mad by the hunger they couldn't control, of those who'd been caught by hunters and subjected to tortures that made death seem like mercy. Each story ended the same way. You see, my darling, this is why you must stay with me, why you must trust me, why you need me. The psychological manipulation was masterful. She never raised her voice, never threatened me directly. She simply painted a picture of a world so hostile, so unforgiving, that staying locked in this room seemed like the only rational choice. The prison bars weren't keeping me in, they were keeping the monsters out. The locks weren't about control, they were about protection. The isolation wasn't imprisonment, it was safety. I started to believe her, or at least, part of me did. The part that felt the burning hunger that consumed me when I went too long without feeding. The part that could hear my own enhanced senses overwhelming me with information I didn't know how to process. The part that was terrified of what I was becoming and desperately wanted someone to tell me it would be okay. But there was another part of me, smaller and quieter but growing steadily stronger, that recognized the truth beneath her words. This wasn't education, it was indoctrination. She wasn't preparing me for the world. She was ensuring I'd be too afraid to ever want to see it. It was during one of Morgana's lessons that I first learned we weren't alone in this place. She'd been teaching me about vampire bloodlines when she casually mentioned the others, other vampires she'd turned over the centuries, other attempts at creating the perfect companion. My blood ran cold. "Where are they?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her expression shifted, something dark passing behind those amber eyes. "Some are resting. Others couldn't adapt to their new existence. The transformation doesn't take with everyone, you understand. Some minds break under the weight of immortality. Some bodies reject the change. You're different, though. You're perfect." The way she said it made my skin crawl. What did arresting mean? Were there others like me, locked in rooms throughout this building, being slowly molded into Morgana's vision of the ideal companion? Or had they failed her tests and been, what, destroyed, abandoned, left to starve in the darkness? That night, after Morgana had left on one of her hunts, I pressed my ear against the wall. At first, I heard nothing but the settling of old wood and the distant sounds of the city beyond. But then, if I concentrated, if I used these new supernatural senses she'd given me, I could hear something else. Breathing. Slow, shallow breathing from somewhere else in the building. And something else, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails against wood, rhythmic and persistent. Someone was tapping out a pattern. No, not a pattern, a message. My hands trembled as I tapped back against the wall. The scratching stopped immediately. Then, after a long pause, it resumed, more urgently this time. Someone else was trapped here. Someone else was trying to communicate, to reach out across the walls that separated us. Over the following nights, I developed a crude code with whoever was on the other side of that wall. Simple taps, one for yes, two for no, different patterns for different questions. Slowly, painfully slowly, I pieced together their story. Their name was Sebastian. Morgana had turned him 3 years ago, or at least, that's how long he thought it had been. Time was difficult to track in the perpetual darkness. He'd been a musician, dying of an overdose in an alley when Morgana found him. Like me, he'd woken up transformed, imprisoned, subjected to Morgana's particular brand of obsessive love. But unlike me, Sebastian had tried to escape. Twice. The first time, he'd managed to pick the lock on his door, only to discover that the silver seals burned him when he tried to cross the threshold. The second time, he'd waited until Morgana was distracted and made a run for it. He'd actually made it outside, had felt wind on his face for the first time in months. Morgana had found him within hours. What happened next? He wouldn't, or couldn't, describe in our limited code. But afterwards, his imprisonment had become more severe. Additional seals on his door. Windows not just barred but completely bricked over. And worst of all, Morgana had stopped visiting him as frequently. She'd started spending more time looking for someone new, someone who would appreciate her gift more than Sebastian had. That someone was me. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't special. I wasn't different. I was simply the latest in a long line of Morgana's obsessions. And when I inevitably disappointed her, when I showed too much independence, asked too many questions, wanted too badly to be free, she would move on to someone else, someone newer, more pliable, more grateful. But she wouldn't destroy me. That would be too final, too much like admitting failure. No, she'd keep me, locked away and slowly starving, a monument to her inability to create the perfect companion. Just like she was keeping Sebastian, just like she was probably keeping others I hadn't yet discovered. There were nights when the moonlight would touch her skin, and something in Morgana would shift. She would become almost human in those moments, or at least what I imagined human might have been like before whatever transformation had claimed us both. On those nights, she would tell me stories, not the poetry from her ancient books, but stories about herself, about the centuries she'd walked this earth, watching kingdoms rise and fall, watching humanity change and evolve while she remained frozen in this perfect, terrible immortality. She spoke of loneliness that stretched across decades like an endless desert. She described the weight of watching everyone she'd ever cared about wither and die while she continued, unchanging and alone. She told me about others she'd tried to turn, to create companions for her eternal journey, and how they'd all failed. Some had gone mad, some had destroyed themselves, some had simply walked into the sun when the burden of immortality became too heavy to bear. But I was different, she insisted. I was special. I was perfect. She'd been searching for someone like me for over 200 years, and finally, she'd found me dying in that harbor. It was fate, she said. Destiny. We were meant to be together forever. In those moments, bathed in moonlight with tears, actual tears, glistening in her amber eyes, I almost believed her. I almost understood. The isolation she described was so profound, so devastating, that part of me wanted to reach out, to comfort her, to tell her I would stay, that I would be the companion she'd been searching for across the centuries. But then morning would come, or what passed for morning in our perpetual darkness, and the locks would still be locked, the bars would still be barred, and Morgana's tenderness would carry that sharp edge again, that possessiveness that felt less like love and more like the way a child clutches a favorite doll, terrified of losing it. On one such moonlit night, Morgana told me about her transformation. She'd been a noblewoman in 18th century France, she said, married to a man who saw her as property, a beautiful object to display at parties and use as he saw fit. She'd been miserable, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, dreaming of freedom she could never have. Then she'd met Marcus, an ancient vampire who'd been drawn to her sadness, her desperate desire to escape her circumstances. He'd offered her immortality, power, freedom from the constraints of her mortal life. She'd accepted without hesitation, eager to shed her human existence like a snake sheds its skin. But the freedom she'd gained came at a cost she hadn't anticipated. As a vampire, she was powerful, yes, immortal, capable of things that would have seemed like miracles in her human life. But she was also alone in a way she'd never been before. The humans she'd once envied for their freedom now seemed like mayflies, living and dying in the blink of an eye. And the vampire who'd turned her, Marcus, had disappeared shortly after her transformation, leaving her to navigate this new existence on her own. She'd spent centuries trying to recreate what Marcus had given her, that sense of connection, of being chosen, of being transformed into something more. She'd turned dozens of people over the years, each time hoping that this one would be different, that this one would stay, that this one would understand and appreciate the gift she was offering. But they always left. Through death or madness or sheer determination, they always found a way to escape her, until she'd learned to make it impossible for them to leave. Until she'd learned about the seals and the locks and the psychological chains that were stronger than any physical barrier. As she told me this story, her hand stroking my hair with disturbing tenderness, I realized something profound and terrible. Morgana wasn't trying to give me the freedom Marcus had given her. She was trying to trap me in the same prison she'd escaped from all those centuries ago. She'd hated being property, being controlled, being kept, and yet that's exactly what she was doing to me. She'd become the very thing she'd once despised, the abuser who'd been abused, the captor who'd once been captive, and she couldn't even see the irony because in her mind, she was doing this out of love. She was protecting me, caring for me, giving me the gift of eternity at her side. But love that mirrors trauma isn't love. It's a cycle of abuse wrapped in prettier words. I started trying to remember. Who had I been before? What was my name? Did I have a family? Friends? A life that mattered to someone other than the creature who now kept me in this velvet prison? The memories would come in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror that refused to fit back together. I'd see flashes, a woman with kind eyes who might have been my mother, laughter around a dinner table, the smell of coffee and fresh bread, sunlight warming my face as I walked down a city street. But every time I tried to hold on to these fragments, they would slip away like water through my fingers. When I asked Morgana about my past, about who I'd been before she found me, her expression would harden in a way that made my newly transformed instincts scream danger. She'd tell me I was confused, delirious, that there was no before, that I had always been hers, that she had created me from the void, that every moment of my existence began and ended with her. The gaslighting was subtle at first. She'd gently correct my memories, suggest different interpretations of the fragments I recalled. That woman I remembered? Probably just a kind stranger I'd seen once. That dinner table? A scene from a movie? Perhaps? The coffee shop? My imagination filling in gaps with generic experiences that felt safe and normal. But as weeks passed, months, I couldn't tell anymore. Her denials became more forceful. She'd tell me I was being ungrateful, that I was hurting her by insisting on a past that never existed. She'd remind me of the harbor, of my broken body, of how she'd saved me from certain death. She'd ask why I wanted to remember a life that had abandoned me, that had left me to die alone in the ruins. And slowly, insidiously, I began to doubt myself. Maybe she was right. Maybe these memories were false, wishful thinking from a mind trying to make sense of its new reality. Maybe I had always been this creature of darkness, and the sunlight I remembered was just a dream. The doubt was almost worse than the imprisonment. At least the locked doors and barred windows were concrete, tangible. But this erosion of self, this systematic dismantling of my identity, was like drowning in quicksand. The harder I fought to hold on to who I'd been, the faster I sank into the void of who Morgana insisted I was. During this period, I became obsessed with small details that Morgana couldn't explain away. A scar on my left wrist that looked like it came from a childhood accident. The way I instinctively knew how to braid hair in a complex pattern, my fingers moving with muscle memory, even though I had no conscious recollection of learning the technique. The fact that I hummed a specific melody when I was nervous. Where had I learned that song? These small pieces of evidence became my anchors. They were proof that I'd existed before Morgana, that I'd had a life and an identity that she couldn't simply erase with her words. I clung to them desperately, afraid that if I let them go, I'd disappear entirely into the creature she was trying to create. One night, while Morgana was out hunting, I discovered something that would change everything. I'd been examining the bookshelf, those leather-bound volumes of dark poetry she loved so much, when one of the books shifted, revealing a gap behind it. Curious, I pulled more books aside and discovered that the back panel of the bookshelf was loose. Behind it was a narrow space, almost like a hidden room, filled with more books. But these weren't poetry collections. These were journals, dozens of them, leather-bound and filled with flowing handwriting in languages I couldn't always read. Some were in English, others in French, a few in what looked like Latin. I pulled out the nearest English journal and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and achingly familiar. It was Morgana's writing. The entry was dated 1847. Found another one today. A girl, barely 20, dying of consumption in a charity hospital. She has the most remarkable eyes, gray like storm clouds, but with flecks of green when the light hits them right. She reminds me of Eleanor, though Eleanor is long gone now. Perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps this one will understand the gift I'm offering. I flipped forward several pages. 3 months since the turning. She's responding well to the transformation, better than most. She doesn't fight the hunger like the others did, but she asks too many questions, wants to know about my past, about the others I've turned. I've told her there were no others, that she's the first, the only. It's easier this way. Knowledge only breeds discontent. Further still, she tried to leave today, found her at the door, clawing at the seals until her fingers bled. The betrayal cuts deeper than any stake. After everything I've given her, everything I've sacrificed to keep her safe, and she wants to leave, to abandon me like all the others. I've reinforced the seals. I won't make the mistake of trusting too much again. The final entry in that journal made my blood run cold. It's been 6 months since I've visited Catherine. She's weakened considerably without regular feeding, but she still won't accept her place at my side. The defiance in her eyes has finally faded, replaced by a hollow resignation that I find almost more unbearable. Tomorrow I'll begin looking for someone new, someone who will appreciate what Catherine couldn't, someone worthy of the gift I have to offer. Catherine. That was the name of the girl in the journal. One of Morgana's previous... projects? Victims? Companions? I grabbed another journal, this one from 1923. His name was James. A soldier, shell-shocked from the war, found wandering the streets and talking to ghosts that only he could see. I thought the madness might make him more pliable, more accepting of his new nature. I was wrong. The transformation only amplified his instability. I had to seal his room completely after he tried to claw his own eyes out, screaming about the darkness inside him. He's still there, in the western wing. Sometimes I can hear him weeping. Another journal, 1962. Sophia lasted longer than most, almost 2 years before she turned bitter and resentful. She was a dancer, beautiful and graceful, and I thought we would have centuries together. But she never stopped trying to escape, never stopped looking at me with accusation in her eyes, as if I were her jailer rather than her savior. I've moved her to the basement. Perhaps in a few decades, when her spirit is properly broken, she'll finally understand that there is no life for her beyond these walls. Journal after journal, century after century, the same story repeated with different names, different circumstances, but always the same ending. Morgana found someone vulnerable, someone dying or desperate, and she transformed them. She imprisoned them, claimed to love them, and when they inevitably rebelled against their captivity, she broke them, or abandoned them, or locked them away to starve. And now I understood with horrifying clarity what my own future held. I was simply the latest entry in a catalog of failures, another name to be written in Morgana's journals with disappointment and possessive love. When I finally broke, and she would make sure I broke, she would lock me away like the others and move on to someone new, someone who might finally be what she wanted. But there was one more journal, newer than the others, with entries from just a few years ago. I opened it to the first page. His name is Sebastian, a musician, an addict, dying in an alley surrounded by needles and broken dreams. But beneath the addiction, I see something pure, a soul that yearns for beauty, for meaning, for transcendence. I can give him all of that. I can make him perfect. Sebastian, the vampire on the other side of the wall. I flipped through the pages, reading Morgana's account of his transformation, his initial gratitude, his growing questions, his first escape attempt. And then I found the entry that made my hands shake. Sebastian is proving disappointing. Too independent, too willful. He doesn't understand that I'm protecting him, that the world would destroy him. I've had to be firmer with him, more decisive. But it's exhausting, constantly fighting his resistance. I find myself thinking about what comes next. Who comes next? There's a harbor on the east side of the city where desperate people sometimes go to end their lives. Perhaps I'll find someone there, someone more grateful, someone perfect. The harbor. My harbor. She'd been planning to replace Sebastian even before she found me. I wasn't a fortunate accident. I was a deliberate choice, carefully selected from the vulnerable and dying to be her next project, her next failure. I carefully replaced the journals and pushed the bookshelf panel back into place, my mind reeling. Everything Morgana had told me was a lie. I wasn't special. I wasn't chosen by fate. I was simply the next in a long line of people she'd broken and discarded in her desperate attempt to cure her own loneliness. But knowing the truth also gave me something I hadn't had before. Clarity. I understood now that there was no winning this game by playing by Morgana's rules. There was no amount of compliance, gratitude, or affection that would earn my freedom. She would keep me here until I broke, and then she would move on to someone else. The only way out was to refuse to play the game at all. Everything changed the night I found the mirror. I'd been exploring the room, my beautiful prison, for the 100th time, running my fingers along the walls, searching for anything I might have missed. That's when I noticed a slight gap behind the bookshelf, a space where the wallpaper didn't quite meet the wood paneling. When I pulled some of the leather-bound volumes aside, I found it, an ornate mirror, its frame carved with the same strange symbols that decorated the door seals, hidden behind Morgana's collection of dark poetry. My hands trembled as I pulled it free, dust falling like gray snow. Why would she hide a mirror? The thought barely had time to form before I turned it to face me, expecting to see my reflection for the first time since my transformation. There was nothing. The mirror showed the room behind me, the bed with its crimson sheets, the chair where Morgana held court, the heavy curtains blocking out the world. But where I should have been standing, there was only empty space, a void in the shape of a person. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the absence of myself. All the old legends about vampires and mirrors suddenly made terrifying sense. We cast no reflection because we have no souls, the stories said. We're empty vessels, animated corpses, parasites wearing the skin of the dead. But as I stared into that void, something else occurred to me. Something that made my dead heart seize with a fear more profound than any I'd felt since waking in this place. The mirror didn't show my reflection because I had none to show, and I had no reflection because I had no true self anymore. Morgana hadn't just transformed my body, she'd erased everything I'd been before. Every memory, every identity, every piece of the person I'd once been had been systematically stripped away and replaced with this hollow thing she called her beloved. The void in the mirror wasn't a supernatural phenomenon, it was literal truth. I was a blank slate, an empty vessel that Morgana had filled with her own needs, her own desires, her own desperate loneliness. That's when I understood. She wasn't afraid that the sun would kill me. She was afraid that if I ever saw the sun again, if I ever tasted freedom, I might remember who I'd been before she erased me. I might reclaim myself, and then I would leave her, just like all the others had, in one way or another. The imprisonment wasn't about protection. It was about control. It was about making sure that the only reality I knew was the one she created. The only identity I possessed was the one she gave me. The only existence I could imagine was the one at her side. In that moment, staring at the void where I should have been, I made a decision. I would rather cease to exist entirely than continue living as Morgana's eternal captive. I would rather burn in the sunlight than spend eternity in the shadows of someone who called this love. I carefully replaced the mirror behind the books, my mind racing. I couldn't let Morgana know what I'd discovered, couldn't let her see that I understood the true nature of my captivity. I had to be patient, had to wait for the right moment. The next time she came to feed me, I drank. I played the part of the grateful progeny, the devoted companion she'd been crafting from the raw material of my erased self. I let her stroke my hair and call me her darling. I listened to her poetry and nodded at the appropriate moments. I became the perfect mirror of what she wanted me to be, ironic, considering I cast no reflection. But inside, I was counting, watching, learning her patterns. Morgana was ancient and powerful, but she was also predictable. She left the same time every few nights, hunting for the sustenance she'd later share with me. She'd seal the door with a whispered incantation, believing the silver symbols and locks were enough to keep me contained. What she didn't know was that I'd been studying those symbols while she slept during the day, or what passed for day in our perpetual darkness. I'd committed them to memory, and in the hours when she was dormant, I'd been trying to understand their meaning. They were binding sigils, meant to cage supernatural energy. But like all magic, they had limitations. They could contain power, but they couldn't erase will. I also began communicating more frequently with Sebastian through the walls. In our crude code of taps and scratches, I told him what I'd learned from the journals, what I'd discovered about Morgana's history, and he told me something that changed everything. There was a way to weaken the seals. Silver seals, he explained, were powered by the caster's intent and sustained by their presence. The further away Morgana was, the weaker the seals became. Not enough for a vampire to break through them completely. That would require breaking Morgana's connection to us entirely, which was virtually impossible while we still fed on the blood she provided. But there was another way. If we stopped feeding, stopped accepting the sustenance she offered, we would weaken our connection to her. And in weakening that connection, we would weaken the seals, hold on us. It wouldn't be enough to let us leave, but it might be enough for something else, something desperate, something final. I started refusing the blood she offered, not all at once. That would have been too obvious. Just small sips instead of draining the goblet. Telling her I was feeling full, content, that she'd given me so much already. She'd smile, pleased by what she interpreted as satisfaction with my new existence. But I wasn't satisfied. I was starving myself, weakening the supernatural bond that tied me to her, the connection she'd forged when she shared her essence. The hunger was excruciating, a burning void that consumed me from the inside out, but it also made me feel more human than I had since my transformation. The pain was real, it was mine. It was proof that somewhere beneath the monster Morgana had created, there was still something that wanted to choose its own fate. Sebastian was doing the same thing in his room. We'd coordinated our plan through the wall, tapping out our progress, encouraging each other when the hunger became almost unbearable. We both knew what the end goal was, even though we never explicitly discussed it. We both knew there was only one way to truly escape Morgana's control. We had to break her connection to us completely. And there was only one thing powerful enough to do that: the sun. During those final days of preparation, I found myself thinking about love. Real love. Not whatever twisted version Morgana had convinced herself she felt. I thought about the fragments of memories I'd managed to hold on to despite her attempts to erase them. I remembered, or thought I remembered, a woman who might have been my mother teaching me to bake bread. She'd let me make mistakes, let me learn, even when it would have been easier to do it herself. That was love, allowing someone to grow, even when it was messy and inefficient. I remembered a friend who'd told me hard truths when I needed to hear them, even though it would have been easier to tell me what I wanted to hear. That was love. Caring enough to risk discomfort for someone else's well-being. What Morgana felt wasn't love. It was need. It was the desperate, consuming need of someone so broken by loneliness that they'd rather destroy another person than face the void alone. She'd remade me not because she loved who I was, but because she couldn't bear who she was without someone to control. True love is liberating. It gives freedom even at the cost of loss. It trusts and hopes and believes in the beloved's ability to choose their own path, even if that path leads away. What Morgana offered was a gilded cage dressed up with poetry and moonlight. A beautiful prison she'd convinced herself was paradise. And the most heartbreaking part? I don't think she understood the difference. In her mind, keeping me locked away, erasing my identity, binding me to her forever, that was love. That was devotion. She genuinely believed she was giving me the greatest gift possible, eternal existence at her side. She couldn't comprehend that existence without autonomy isn't life. It's a living death. That immortality without choice is just another form of imprisonment, one that stretches across centuries instead of years. That transformation without consent is violence, no matter how tenderly it's performed. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because beneath the monster she'd become, I could glimpse the person she might have been before centuries of loneliness had twisted her understanding of love into something unrecognizable. But pity wasn't enough to make me stay. Empathy wasn't a good enough reason to sacrifice my own chance at freedom, however brief it might be. There came a night when Morgana noticed something was wrong. I'd grown too weak, too pale even by vampire standards. My hands trembled when I reached for the goblet, and my movements had become sluggish, uncertain. She knelt beside my bed, amber eyes filled with concern that might have seemed genuine if I didn't know better. "You're not feeding properly," she said, her cool hand against my forehead. "Why are you denying yourself? This is what you are now, my darling. Fighting your nature only brings suffering." I looked up at her, and for the first time since my transformation, I let her see the truth in my eyes. "What am I, Morgana? What did you make me?" Her expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been guilt, but it was quickly replaced by that familiar possessive tenderness. "I made you eternal. I made you powerful. I made you mine." "No," I said quietly. "You made me nothing. You erased who I was and replaced it with what you wanted. That's not creation. That's destruction." Her hand tightened on my arm, not quite painful but close. "I saved you. You were dying, broken, abandoned. I gave you a second chance, a gift beyond measure, and this is how you repay me, with ingratitude and accusations. You never asked what I wanted. You took someone vulnerable, someone who couldn't consent, and you reshaped them into your ideal companion. That's not love, Morgana. That's narcissism. That's abuse." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Morgana stood, her face hardening into something ancient and terrible. "You don't understand. You're too young, too naive. In a few decades, you'll see that I was right. You'll thank me for protecting you from yourself." "I've read your journals," I said, watching her face carefully. "I know about Catherine and James and Sophia and all the others. I know about Sebastian, still locked away because he dared to want freedom. You don't protect us, Morgana. You collect us. And when we don't perform the way you want, you discard us and find someone new." For a long moment, she simply stared at me, and I wondered if I'd pushed too far, if she would destroy me right then, rather than let me continue defying her. But instead, she did something I didn't expect. She laughed. It was a terrible sound, empty and cold as a winter wind. "You think you've discovered some great truth? You think understanding my past gives you power over me?" She moved closer, her face inches from mine. "I am 200 years old, child. I have forgotten more about survival than you will ever learn. Every single one of them thought they could outwit me, thought they could escape, and every single one of them is still here, still mine, because I am inevitable. You cannot fight me. You cannot leave me. You can only choose whether your eternity will be pleasant or unpleasant." "Then I choose unpleasant," I said, "because at least that's my choice." Her hand shot out, gripping my throat with inhuman strength. Not quite crushing, but making it abundantly clear that she could if she wanted to. "You don't get to choose," she hissed. "You gave up choice the moment you accepted my gift. You are mine, my creation, my possession, and I will keep you here until you understand that." She released me, and I collapsed back onto the bed, gasping. Morgana moved to the door, her movements rigid with rage. No more books, no more poetry. You want to act like a prisoner? I'll treat you like one. Perhaps a few weeks in the dark, alone with your thoughts, will teach you gratitude. The door slammed shut, and I heard the locks engage with brutal finality. The seal on the door flared bright silver, pulsing with renewed power fueled by Morgana's anger. But she'd made a mistake. In her rage, she'd admitted the truth. I was a possession, not a beloved. She'd dropped the pretense, revealed the iron fist beneath the velvet glove. And in doing so, she'd freed me from any lingering doubt about what I needed to do. Through the wall, I heard Sebastian's tapping. A simple message. Soon. I tapped back. Soon. The night finally came when I knew I was ready. Morgana had left on one of her hunts, and I could feel through our connection that she was far away, lost in the euphoria of the chase. She'd be gone for hours. I was weak from starvation, my body consuming itself in the absence of the blood I'd been refusing. But that weakness was also liberation. The connection to Morgana, that invisible tether that bound me to her will, had frayed to almost nothing. The seals on the door still glowed, but faintly now, like dying embers. I walked to the heavy curtains, my hand shaking as I reached for the velvet fabric. Behind these drapes was a window that opened to the east. I'd discovered this weeks ago, noticed how the azure glow brightened just slightly in what must have been morning, even through the thick material. The bars were there, of course, but they weren't designed to keep out the light, just to keep me in. And light, I was learning, could seep through any crack, any gap. It would be enough. It would have to be enough. Before I touched the curtains, I pressed my ear against the wall one last time. Sebastian was there, waiting. I tapped out a message. Thank you, for reminding me I wasn't alone. His response came quickly. We're all free tonight. One way or another. I knew what he meant. He was going to do the same thing. We'd both been preparing for this, both starving ourselves, both weakening our bonds to Morgana. And now, while she was away, while her attention was focused elsewhere, we would both choose our own endings. It occurred to me that this was perhaps the cruelest thing we could do to her, not escaping to some other life, but choosing no life at all rather than existence at her side. She would return to find both of her current captives gone, turned to ash by the sun they'd been denied for so long. She would have to face the reality that her love was so poisonous that we'd prefer death to eternity with her. I thought about what Morgana would feel when she returned to find me gone. The rage first, probably, then the grief. She would tell herself I'd been taken, stolen by those monsters she'd warned me about. She would never accept that I'd chosen to leave, that I'd chosen potential annihilation over certain imprisonment. Part of me, the part she'd tried so hard to create, wanted to write her a letter, to explain, to somehow make her understand. But what could I say? That 200 years of loneliness didn't give her the right to erase another person's existence. That her pain didn't justify causing mine. She would never understand. She'd read any explanation as betrayal, as ingratitude, as proof that I was too young and foolish to appreciate the gift she'd given me. So instead, I simply waited. I sat in that chair where she always sat, the one she'd claimed as her throne, and I watched the gap beneath the curtains. Slowly, painfully slowly, the darkness began to shift. The azure glow grew brighter, tinged with something new, something warm. Gold, the color of honey and amber, ironically the color of Morgana's eyes. But this gold was different. This gold was alive, burning, real. This was the sun I'd been told would destroy me, the sun Morgana had worked so hard to keep me from ever seeing again. My body screamed warnings. Every supernatural instinct Morgana had awakened in me was howling to retreat, to hide, to seek the darkness. But I forced myself to stay in that chair, forced myself to watch as the light grew stronger. I thought about the mirror, about the void where my reflection should have been. I thought about how Morgana had called me her love while systematically destroying everything that made me who I was. I thought about eternal nights stretching ahead of me, century after century of beautiful imprisonment, of poetry and blood and locked doors. And I thought about sunlight, the feeling of it on my face, a memory so faint I couldn't be sure it was real. Warmth, freedom, the simple, profound joy of choosing to step outside on a beautiful day. The first true ray of sunlight pierced through the gap in the curtains, and it was like being stabbed with molten gold. My skin began to smoke where the light touched it, and the pain was unlike anything I'd experienced, and I say that as someone who'd been transformed into a vampire, who'd felt their entire existence being rewritten at a cellular level. But beneath the pain, there was something else, something I hadn't expected. Clarity. As the sunlight touched me, as my body began to react to it, memories flooded back with stunning force. Not fragments anymore, but complete, vivid recollections. I remembered my name, Ilara. I remembered my mother's laugh, loud and unrestrained. I remembered my best friend, Marcus, and how we'd stayed up all night talking about our dreams. I remembered the coffee shop where I'd worked, the smell of roasted beans and the sound of the espresso machine. I remembered the mistake I'd made, the wrong person I'd trusted, the night at the harbor that had ended with me broken and bleeding among the ruins. But I also remembered what came before that night. I remembered being alive, really alive, making choices, making mistakes, learning and growing and changing. I remembered being whole, being myself, being free. The sunlight burned, yes, but it also illuminated. It revealed what Morgana had tried so desperately to hide from me, the truth of who I'd been, the person she'd worked so hard to erase. She hadn't saved me at the harbor. She'd found a vulnerable, dying girl and seen an opportunity, a blank slate she could mold into the perfect, eternal companion. And the most devastating realization of all, I'd had a choice at the harbor. Morgana had asked me, in those final moments before death claimed me, if I wanted to live forever. But I'd been delirious, in shock, barely conscious. I hadn't understood what I was agreeing to. I'd thought she was offering to call an ambulance, to get me to a hospital. I hadn't known she was asking permission to transform me into this. She'd taken my confused, desperate yes and used it to justify everything that came after. Every locked door, every erased memory, every night of imprisonment, all justified by a consent I'd never truly given, extracted from someone too broken to understand what they were consenting to. The rage that filled me then was hotter than the sunlight burning my skin. But here's the thing about the sun. It doesn't kill vampires instantly. That's a Hollywood invention. The truth is much slower, much more agonizing. It burns us gradually, layer by layer, giving us plenty of time to change our minds, to retreat into the darkness, to choose survival over principle. As I sat there, feeling my skin blister and crack, watching smoke rise from my hands, I had a moment of profound understanding. Morgana would return soon. She'd sense my distress through our connection and come racing back. She'd find me here, wounded but not yet destroyed, and she'd pull me back from the light. She'd heal me with her blood, bind me more tightly to her, and this time she'd make sure I could never reach the windows again. Unless I did something she couldn't anticipate. Unless I made a choice she couldn't imagine I was capable of making. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked to the curtains. My hands, already smoking and blistered, reached for the velvet fabric. And I pulled. The curtains came down in a cascade of heavy fabric, and suddenly the room was flooded with light. Golden, glorious, merciless light that poured through the barred windows like a blessing and a curse all at once. The pain was indescribable. My entire body erupted in flames. Not literal fire, but it felt like it. Every nerve ending screamed. My skin charred and peeled. The smoke rising from me grew thicker, darker, but I didn't run. I didn't hide. Instead, I walked to the window and pressed my hands against the bars, feeling the silver burn my palms even as the sunlight consumed me from every other direction. And I looked out at the world I'd been kept from. A world that was waking up, going about its normal day. I saw people walking on the street below, alive, free, making their own choices about where to go and what to do. I saw birds flying past, indifferent to the cosmic drama playing out in this room. I saw the sun itself, a ball of fire in the eastern sky that had never looked so beautiful. I thought I would feel fear in these final moments, or anger, or regret. But instead, I felt something unexpected. Peace. For the first time since waking in Morgana's room, since being transformed into something I never asked to become, I was making a choice that was entirely mine. Not influenced by her manipulation, not constrained by her locks and seals, not shaped by her desperate need to not be alone. This was my choice, my decision, my will, exerted one final time before the sun claimed me completely. From somewhere in the building, I heard another sound. A cry that might have been anguish or might have been release. Sebastian, I realized, he was doing it too. He'd torn down his own curtains, let in his own sunlight. We were escaping together, two prisoners choosing freedom through the only door left open to us. I heard the door to my room burst open behind me, heard Morgana's scream of rage and anguish. Through our fading connection, I felt her emotions crash over me like a tsunami. Denial, horror, desperate love, and underneath it all, the crushing realization that she'd lost me. Not to the monsters she'd warned me about, not to some outside force she could fight, but to my own determination to be free, even if freedom meant death. She called my name, my real name, the one she'd tried to make me forget, and in that moment, I knew she finally understood what she'd done. She'd created a prison so perfect, so complete, that the only escape was annihilation, and I'd chosen it willingly, gratefully, over an eternity in her gilded cage. I felt her hands grab me, trying to pull me back from the window, back into the shadows. But I was too far gone. The sun had already claimed too much, and more importantly, I wouldn't let her save me this time. I'd rather dissolve into light than exist forever in her darkness. "Please," she was saying, her voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before. "Please, Alara, don't leave me. I'll change. I'll let you go. Just don't do this. Don't leave me alone again." But her promises came too late, made from desperation rather than understanding. Even if I could have survived, even if I could have stepped back from the light, what kind of freedom would she have offered? How long before her loneliness overwhelmed her good intentions? How long before the locks returned, disguised as concerns for my safety? No. This was the only way to be truly free. There's a strange clarity that comes at the end. As my body began to disintegrate, as I felt myself becoming ash and smoke and memory, I had one last profound thought. Morgana had told me I wasn't ready for the world outside. But she was wrong. I wasn't ready for her world. The cold, controlled existence of a captured thing that only reflected someone else's desires. What I'd been ready for, what I'd been craving all along, was the sun. The real, burning, honest truth of it. The freedom it represented, even if that freedom came at the ultimate cost. She'd tried to make me a creature of eternal night, but somewhere inside me, some essential spark had remained stubbornly human. That spark remembered what it felt like to choose, to change, to grow, and it had been willing to burn itself out rather than let that capacity be taken away forever. As the world faded to white light, as I felt the last remnants of my transformed body giving way, I thought about what I was leaving behind. Not much, in the grand scheme of things. A beautiful monster who would grieve for me in her own twisted way. A room full of velvet and poetry and chains disguised as love. A mirror that would never again need to hide the void where I should have been. But I was also taking something with me into whatever came next. The knowledge that I'd reclaimed myself. In those final moments, remembering my name, my life, my identity, I'd become whole again. Not the person I'd been before the harbor. That girl was gone forever, stolen by circumstances and a vampire's desperate loneliness. But I'd become someone new. Someone who understood the true cost of freedom and was willing to pay it. Through the growing brightness, I heard Morgana's voice, broken and raw, begging me to hold on, promising to let me go if I just stayed, making offers she would never have made when she thought she had me safely imprisoned. But it was too late for negotiations, too late for promises of freedom that would have come with invisible strings attached, too late for everything except goodbye. I wanted to tell her that I forgave her, or maybe that I didn't forgive her. Or maybe that forgiveness was irrelevant in the face of what she'd done. But I couldn't speak anymore. My voice had gone the way of my solid form, dissolving into particles of light and ash. So instead, I simply let go. Let go of the anger and the fear and the desperate need to make her understand. Let go of the fragments of memories I'd clung to so fiercely. Let go of the identity she'd tried to create and the one I'd been trying to reclaim. Let go of everything except that one perfect moment of choice, that final act of will that was completely and utterly my own. The last thing I heard before consciousness faded entirely was Morgana's cry, not of rage now, but of understanding. Too late, far too late. She finally grasped what she'd done. The depth of the violation, the magnitude of the harm, the twisted nature of what she'd called love. And then there was only light and warmth, and finally, mercifully, peace. What they found the next evening was 2 rooms full of ash. The curtains torn down, the windows open, letting in light that no longer had anyone to harm. The neighbors would tell the police they'd heard screaming around dawn, but by the time anyone came to investigate, there was nothing left but dust and the faint smell of something burning. They'd search for Morgana, of course. But she'd vanished completely, as if she'd never existed at all. Some say she was spotted in other cities over the years, Prague, New Orleans, Tokyo, always alone, always watching the vulnerable and desperate with those distinctive amber eyes. But whether she ever tried to create another companion, whether she learned anything from the loss of Alara and Sebastian, no one could say. The building was eventually sold, renovated, turned into luxury apartments for people who knew nothing of its history. But sometimes, on particularly clear mornings when the sun streams through the eastern windows, residents report a strange phenomenon. For just a moment, in the light, they see something, not quite a shadow, not quite a reflection. The impression of 2 figures standing by the windows, faces turned toward the sun, holding on to each other as they dissolve into the dawn. The sensation never lasts more than a heartbeat, but those who experience it always describe the same feeling. Not fear, not sadness, but an overwhelming sense of liberation, of choice reclaimed, of freedom earned at the highest cost and still deemed worth the price. And in the walls, if you listen very carefully in the quiet hours before dawn, you might hear it, a rhythmic tapping, like a heartbeat, like a message, like a warning to anyone who might need it. 1 tap, yes, you can escape. 2 taps, no, you don't have to stay. 3 taps, choose yourself, even when it costs everything. 4 taps, love that imprisons isn't love at all. And then silence, until the next person needs to hear it. Morgana's journals. The final entry. Hidden in a safe deposit box in a bank that would later be demolished, investigators eventually found one last journal. This one was different from the others, not carefully cataloged accounts of her creations, but raw, unfiltered grief. The last entry was dated the morning after Alara's death. I held the ashes in my hands, all that remained of the most perfect creature I'd ever created, reduced to dust and char by the sun I'd tried so hard to protect her from. Sebastian's ashes, too, mingled with hers in the hallway where I'd tried desperately to reach them both, to pull them back from their chosen destruction. I keep asking myself, what did I do wrong? I gave them everything. Safety, immortality, companionship, love. I protected them from a world that would have destroyed them. I made them special, powerful, eternal. But as I sit here in the ruins of my carefully constructed sanctuary, surrounded by the ashes of my failures, I'm beginning to understand something that terrifies me more than any stake or sunlight ever could. I didn't give them everything. I gave them everything except choice, everything except autonomy, everything except themselves. I have lived for 200 years, and I have never learned the difference between saving and capturing, between loving and possessing, between protection and imprisonment. Alara remembered her name at the end. I heard her whisper it as she stood in the sunlight. I'd tried so hard to make her forget, to erase the girl she'd been, to create someone new who would never want to leave. And in doing so, I created someone whose only path to reclaiming herself was through annihilation. I think about my own transformation, all those centuries ago, about Marcus, who turned me and then left me free to find my own way in this new existence. I thought he'd abandoned me. I spent decades resenting him for not staying, for not guiding me, for not keeping me close. But now I understand. He loved me enough to let me go. To let me make my own mistakes, forge my own path, become my own kind of monster. What I mistook for abandonment was actually the greatest gift he could have given me. The freedom to choose who I would become. And I repaid that gift by doing the exact opposite to every person I've turned since. I kept them, controlled them, shaped them, broke them when they tried to leave. I became the very thing I'd hated in my mortal life. The jailer, the controller, the one who sees people as possessions to be kept rather than individuals to be known. I don't know if I can change. 200 years of loneliness is a powerful teacher, and it's taught me all the wrong lessons. It's taught me to grasp rather than release, to control rather than trust, to imprison rather than love. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps I don't deserve to change. Perhaps the price of my crimes, and they were crimes, I see that now, is to spend the rest of my eternal existence alone, knowing that I had countless opportunities for real connection and destroyed every single one through my desperate need to possess it. Elara chose the sun, so did Sebastian, and in choosing it, they taught me something I should have learned centuries ago, that existence without choice isn't life, no matter how beautiful the cage. That love without freedom is just another word for possession, that you cannot save someone by erasing who they are. I have been a monster for 200 years, but not the kind I thought. The real monstrosity wasn't in my need for blood or my supernatural nature. It was in my absolute inability to see the people I claimed to love as anything other than reflections of my own needs. The sun rises every morning, indifferent to whether vampires burn in its light. Life continues, humans wake and sleep and dream and die, and the world spins on whether I exist or not. Perhaps that's the final lesson, that we are not as important as we think, that our loneliness, however profound, does not give us the right to steal someone else's autonomy, that our pain does not justify causing pain in others. I am putting down this pen now. I am sealing this journal. I don't know what comes next for me. Perhaps more centuries of solitude. Perhaps a walk into the sun like the ones I imprisoned. Perhaps something else entirely. But I know this. I will not create another companion. I will not turn another dying soul into an eternal prisoner. If I must be alone, then I will be alone. It is better to bear the weight of loneliness than to relieve it by destroying someone else. This is not redemption. There is no redemption for what I've done. The list of names is too long, the catalog of destroyed lives too extensive. But perhaps it is a beginning, a recognition, a choice to stop the cycle before it claims more victims. Elara, Sebastian, Catherine, James, Sophia, and all the others whose names fill the pages of my journals, I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, don't deserve it, but I want you to know, wherever you are, that you were right about all of it. Love that imprisons isn't love at all. And a cage is still a cage, no matter how beautiful. Goodbye. The journal ended there. What became of Morgana after that final entry remains a mystery. Some claim she still walks the night, a cautionary tale whispered among the supernatural community. Others insist she finally found the courage to follow her creations into the sun, seeking the peace of annihilation over the agony of guilty immortality. But every so often, in cities around the world, there are reports. A mysterious figure who appears when someone vulnerable is dying, who asks a question, and who, when told no, or even when the answer is uncertain, calls an ambulance instead, who stays until help arrives, and then vanishes into the night. Whether this figure is Morgana, attempting to atone for centuries of harm, or simply an urban legend born from desperate hope, no one can say. What is known is this. In that building where Elara and Sebastian chose the sun, in those rooms that have been renovated and repainted and filled with people who know nothing of the tragedy that occurred there, something remains. Not a haunting in the traditional sense, not a ghost or a curse, but rather a presence, a reminder, a warning and a promise, whispered in the quality of sunlight that streams through those eastern windows every dawn. Choose yourself. You have the right to leave. Love that requires imprisonment isn't love. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk into the light.